Long before Rome became the greatest empire in history, it was just a small settlement by the banks of the Tiber River. But how did such a tiny village grow into a power that would eventually control the known world? To answer that, we have to go all the way back to the beginning. The legends, the myths, and the first kings who shaped Rome. The Romans themselves loved stories of their own origins. And the most famous one begins with two brothers, Romulus and Remus. According to tradition, they were the sons of Rhea Silvia, a Vestal virgin, and Mars, the god of war. Abandoned at birth and left to die, the infants were saved by something incredible. A she-wolf found them and nursed them back to life. Imagine that for a moment. The future founders of the greatest city on earth, suckling from a wild animal, growing strong in the wilderness. Later, a shepherd found them, raised them, and gave them the chance to grow into leaders. But destiny is rarely peaceful. The two brothers argued about where to build their city. Romulus preferred the Palatine Hill, Remus the Aventine. In the end, violence settled the dispute. Romulus killed his own brother and became the first king of the new city. He named it Rome, after himself. Do you see what this story is saying? From the very start, Rome was tied to struggle, ambition, and blood. Now, some historians say this is just myth, but myth matters because Romans believed it. They built their identity around the idea that their city was born from sacrifice, guided by the gods, and destined for greatness. And it wasn't only Romulus. Another myth claimed Rome's founders were descended from Aeneas, a Trojan hero who escaped the fall of Troy and traveled to Italy. In this version, Rome wasn't just a city. It was the heir of ancient Troy with a destiny to rule. But let's step away from legends for a moment. What do we actually know? Archaeology tells us that by the 8th century BCE, small villages dotted the hills around the Tiber. Farmers, shepherds, and traders lived here, building simple huts. Over time, these little communities began to join together. The Palatine Hill, where Romulus supposedly built his city, was one of the earliest centers. Slowly, the scattered settlements merged into a single town. Why here? Geography. The Tiber River provided water and trade. The surrounding hills offered protection. And most importantly, Rome sat at a crossroads, halfway between northern and southern Italy, and between the sea and the inland routes. It was the perfect place for a city to grow. According to tradition, Rome had 7 kings. Each one, the Romans believed, added something important. Romulus gave the city its first laws and its senate, a council of elders. Numa Pompilius, the second king, was said to have been wise and deeply religious. He built temples, established rituals, and made sure the people honored the gods. Have you noticed the pattern? Every king wasn't just a ruler, they were a piece of Rome's foundation. The third king, Tullus Hostilius, was warlike. He expanded Rome's territory, showing that the city would not survive on farming alone, but by conquest. The fourth, Ancus Marcius, looked outward, building Rome's first port at Ostia and encouraging trade. Already we can see Rome's balance. Religion, war, trade, and politics, all growing together. But then came something that changed everything. The fifth king, Lucius Tarquinius Priscus, wasn't even Roman. He was Etruscan. The Etruscans were a powerful people to the north, and they brought with them new skills, technology, and culture. Tarquinius introduced great building projects, sewers, temples, and the Circus Maximus, Rome's first arena. The city was transforming from huts into a true urban center. His successors continued this trend. Servius Tullius, the sixth king, organized Rome's population into classes based on wealth and military service. For the first time, Rome's army wasn't just a band of warriors. It was structured, disciplined, and tied directly to citizenship. Doesn't that sound like the Rome we later recognize? But the monarchy didn't last. The last king, Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, his nickname means the proud, became infamous for his arrogance and cruelty. According to legend, his son committed a crime so terrible that it sparked a revolution. He assaulted a noblewoman named Lucretia, who took her own life out of shame. The Roman people, outraged, rose up and expelled the Tarquins. And so, in 509 BCE, the monarchy ended, and the Roman Republic began. But think about what this means. The Romans weren't just rejecting one king, they were rejecting the very idea of kingship. From then on, they swore never to be ruled by a king again. That hatred of monarchy would shape everything that came later, even centuries into the empire. Now, let's pause. We've heard myths of wolves and heroes, kings both wise and cruel, and the birth of a city from small villages. But beneath the stories lies something real. Rome's early history set patterns that lasted forever. Violence and ambition, yes, but also adaptability. The Romans borrowed from their neighbors. The Etruscans gave them engineering. The Greeks gave them art and religion. And then they made those things their own. This ability to absorb and transform would one day make them masters of the world. Yet we shouldn't imagine that Rome in 509 BCE looked anything like the empire we know. It was still just a city-state, small compared to Carthage or the Greek colonies of Italy. No one at that time could have guessed that this little community would one day dominate Europe, Africa, and Asia. And that is what makes the story so fascinating. How did Rome go from huts on 7 hills to ruling the known world? The answer begins with what came after the kings, the Republic with its struggles, wars, and ambition. But before we leave this first chapter, let's ask, what does the story of Rome's origins tell us about the people who built it? Why did they choose to remember their city as founded in violence, guided by gods and ruled by proud kings who were overthrown? Perhaps because deep down, the Romans knew that power is never peaceful. Power is fought for, won, and held by those willing to seize it. And Rome, from its very beginning, was willing. When the Romans drove out their kings in 509 BCE, they didn't just change leaders, they reinvented their entire system of government. But here's the puzzle. How do you run a state without a king, without letting anyone gain too much power, and still keep control? The Romans answered this by creating one of the most influential political systems in history, the Republic. And while it wasn't always fair or peaceful, it laid the foundation for Rome's rise. So what exactly was the Roman Republic? At its heart, it was a compromise. The Romans hated kings, but they knew someone still had to lead. Their solution was to divide power. Instead of one ruler, they elected 2 consuls every year. These men commanded the army, directed the government, and acted as the highest officials. But here's the catch. Their term lasted only 12 months. Why? To prevent anyone from becoming another Tarquin the Proud. If one consul tried to seize too much power, the other could block him. Doesn't that sound a lot like checks and balances, the same principle that modern democracies use today? But consuls weren't the only part of this new system. The Senate, originally an advisory council of elders under the kings, now gained enormous influence. Senators were usually aristocrats, wealthy patricians who saw themselves as guardians of Rome's traditions. They didn't pass laws at first, but their advice carried so much weight that it became almost impossible to govern without them. And then there were the assemblies, gatherings of Roman citizens who could vote on laws, elect officials, and make decisions about war and peace. On paper, it might look like the people had power, but in reality, the rich and powerful still dominated. This new system worked, at least at the beginning. It kept Rome stable, gave citizens a voice, and allowed leaders to rise without turning into kings. But here's the problem. Not everyone in Rome was happy with how the Republic was run. The city was divided into 2 main classes. At the top were the patricians, wealthy families who claimed noble ancestry. At the bottom were the plebeians, the common citizens, farmers, craftsmen, soldiers. They outnumbered the patricians by far, but they had little real power. This tension exploded into what became known as the conflict of the orders. Plebeians demanded more rights, and they weren't afraid to use bold tactics. At one point, they even threatened to abandon the city entirely and refuse to fight in the army. Imagine that, the people who made up the bulk of Rome's soldiers simply walking away. Without them, Rome had no defense. The patricians had no choice but to negotiate. So what did the plebeians want? First, they wanted protection against unfair treatment. patrician officials often abused their power, arresting plebeians or forcing them into debt slavery. To fix this, the Romans created the office of the tribune of the plebs. Tribunes were elected by the plebeians, and they had one extraordinary power: veto. If a consul or magistrate tried to pass something harmful to the people, a tribune could shout veto, meaning "I forbid it," and stop the decision in its tracks. Doesn't that sound revolutionary for its time? The plebeians also pushed for written laws. Before, Rome's legal system was based on custom, controlled by patricians who could twist it to their advantage. In 451 BCE, a special commission was set up, and soon Rome had its first written code, the 12 Tables. These laws were displayed publicly, so everyone knew their rights. The laws covered daily life, property, contracts, family matters, even punishments. They weren't always fair by our standards. Some rules were harsh, especially against debtors and women, but they marked a huge step forward. For the first time, Roman law applied to all citizens, not just the elite. But gaining equality wasn't easy. The struggle between patricians and plebeians lasted for generations. Slowly, plebeians won more rights. The ability to hold office, to become priests, even to marry into patrician families. By 367 BCE, the reforms of Licinius and Sextius finally allowed plebeians to become consuls, the highest office in Rome. Think about that for a moment. In just over a century, ordinary citizens went from having almost no voice to being able to reach the very top of government. That shows you the power of persistence in politics. Meanwhile, Rome was not just fighting battles inside its walls. It was also fighting outside enemies. The early republic had to defend itself constantly against neighboring tribes, the Etruscans to the north, the Latins and Volsci to the south, and the Sabines nearby. Rome wasn't yet the powerhouse it would become, but its military was already shaping into something unique. Soldiers were organized into legions, citizen militias that gave Rome flexibility and strength. Service in the army wasn't just about defense, it was a duty, a way to prove loyalty to the Republic. One of the most fascinating things about Rome at this time is how adaptable it was. Whenever Rome faced a crisis, it found a way to adjust. Take, for example, the office of dictator. If the Republic was in serious danger, like a foreign invasion, the Romans could appoint a dictator with absolute power. But here's the twist. The dictatorship was temporary. 6 months, no more. After that, the dictator had to step down. This idea allowed Rome to survive emergencies without destroying its system. And perhaps the most famous early example is Cincinnatus, a farmer who was called from his plow to serve as dictator. He defeated Rome's enemies in just 16 days, then returned to his farm. His story became a Roman ideal, leadership as service, not ambition. But here's the question. Did Rome really solve its problems or just push them forward? Yes, plebeians gained rights, but inequality didn't disappear. Yes, power was divided, but ambitious men still found ways to bend the rules. And yes, Rome defended itself against enemies, but in doing so, it began to conquer more territory. Already you can see the seeds of what Rome would become. A state that expanded endlessly, managed constant internal conflict, and relied on a system both flexible and fragile. By the end of this period, around 367 BCE, Rome had transformed. It was no longer a city ruled by kings, nor just a small settlement struggling to survive. It was a republic, unique, ambitious, and increasingly powerful. The plebeians had secured a place in government. The army had become the backbone of Roman society, and the Senate was already positioning itself as the real power behind the scenes. But remember, Rome's story is never simple. The Republic gave Romans pride, but it also created tensions that would never go away. The balance of power between rich and poor, between Senate and assemblies, between ambition and tradition. These battles would shape Rome for centuries. And as Rome grew stronger, so did the stakes. Because what happens when a republic built on equality and compromise starts to conquer others? Can it still remain true to its ideals, or does expansion lead it down a darker path? By the middle of the 4th century BCE, Rome was no longer just a small republic fighting for survival. It had grown stronger, Its political system had matured, and its citizens were more united than ever. But Rome was still only one city among many on the Italian peninsula. To the north were the Etruscans, to the south the powerful Greek colonies, and everywhere in between, smaller tribes, Samnites, Latins, Sabines, Umbrians. If Rome wanted to secure its future, it had to do more than survive. It had to conquer, and that is exactly what it set out to do. But how do you take a city-state and turn it into a dominant power over all of Italy? The answer lies in war, strategy, and something uniquely Roman, the ability to adapt and absorb. Let's start with one of Rome's earliest challenges, the Gauls. In 390 BCE, a Gallic tribe swept into Italy and defeated the Roman army at the Battle of the Allia. The city of Rome itself was captured and sacked. Imagine what that must have felt like, seeing your city burned, your temples looted, your people humiliated. Most states would never recover from such a disaster. But the Romans had something special: resilience. They rebuilt their walls stronger, reorganized their defenses, and learned from their mistakes. Instead of breaking Rome, the sack of the city hardened it. It became a turning point that convinced the Romans they had to become stronger than every enemy around them. And enemies there were plenty. Soon Rome found itself at war with the Samnites, a tough mountain people who lived in central Italy. These wars, known as the Samnite Wars, stretched for decades. They were brutal, drawn-out conflicts that tested Rome's endurance. The Samnites were skilled warriors who fought in difficult terrain, ambushing Roman armies in the mountains. One of Rome's most humiliating defeats came at the Caudine Forks in 321 BCE, when Roman soldiers were trapped and forced to march under a yoke as a symbol of submission. Think about that. An entire army humiliated, made to walk bent under a wooden frame in front of their enemies. But did Rome give up? Of course not. It came back reorganized and eventually crushed the Samnites. This is where Rome's true genius began to shine. It wasn't just about fighting. It was about what happened after the fighting. Unlike many ancient powers, Rome didn't simply destroy defeated peoples. Instead, it offered them a deal. Conquered cities could keep much of their local government, their traditions, and even some independence. In return, they had to provide soldiers for Rome's army and accept Roman leadership. This system, known as the Roman Confederation, allowed Rome to expand rapidly without constant rebellion. Instead of ruling by fear alone, Rome ruled by partnership, though always on its own terms. But there was another factor that gave Rome an edge: its military system. During this time, Rome shifted from fighting in the old Greek-style phalanx to a more flexible formation called the Manipular Legion. Instead of one massive block of soldiers, Roman armies were divided into smaller units that could move independently. This made them far more effective in Italy's rugged terrain. The Manipular Legion was tough, disciplined, and adaptable, and it would become one of the keys to Rome's dominance for centuries. Rome's conquests didn't stop with the Samnites. By the early 3rd century BCE, Rome was fighting on all fronts, against the Etruscans in the north, the Umbrians and Gauls in the center, and Greek colonies in the south. And here's where the story gets even more dramatic. One of these Greek colonies, Tarentum, felt threatened by Rome's expansion. They called for help from a powerful ally across the sea, King Pyrrhus of Epirus. Pyrrhus was no ordinary king. He was one of the most talented generals of his age, even compared to Alexander the Great. In 280 BCE, he brought a professional army to Italy, complete with war elephants, creatures the Romans had never seen before. Imagine the shock of Roman soldiers facing massive elephants charging down on them for the first time. At the Battle of Heraclea, Pyrrhus defeated the Romans. At the Battle of Asculum, he won again. But here's the twist: his victories came at a terrible cost. He lost so many men in each battle that he supposedly said, "Another victory like this, and I am undone." That's where the term Pyrrhic victory comes from. A win so costly that it feels like defeat. Rome, on the other hand, could always replace its losses. Citizen after citizen, generation after generation, Rome sent new soldiers to the field. This determination wore Pyrrhus down. By 275 BCE, he withdrew from Italy, leaving the Romans to claim victory. Now, with Pyrrhus gone, the Greek cities of southern Italy fell under Roman control. By 264 BCE, Rome had achieved something extraordinary. It dominated the entire Italian peninsula. From the Po Valley in the north to the tip of Calabria in the south, Rome had secured its position as the strongest power in Italy. But here's what makes this period truly fascinating. Rome didn't just conquer through violence. It built a system that held everything together. Defeated enemies became allies, supplying troops and resources. Roads were built to connect the new territories, making it easier to move armies and trade goods. Step by step, Rome created the infrastructure of an empire, even before it was officially won. But let's not forget, conquest always comes with consequences. By absorbing so many peoples, Rome also absorbed their cultures. The Romans borrowed religion, art, and ideas from the Etruscans and Greeks. At the same time, managing all these alliances created constant tension. Could Rome really keep everyone loyal forever? And if Rome was now the master of Italy, what would it do next? Stay within its borders or look outward? The answer is clear from history. Rome never stayed still. Once it conquered Italy, it turned its gaze to the wider Mediterranean. But standing in its way was a powerful rival across the sea, a city that controlled trade, commanded fleets, and held vast wealth. That city was Carthage, and the clash between Rome and Carthage would shape the next chapter of Rome's story, leading to some of the most famous wars in ancient history. By 264 BCE, Rome had conquered Italy, but across the sea, another power was waiting. That power was Carthage, a wealthy city in North Africa that commanded one of the greatest naval empires of the ancient world. Carthage controlled trade routes across the Mediterranean. Its fleets sailed everywhere, and its wealth came from colonies in Spain, Sicily, and beyond. If Rome wanted to expand further, a collision with Carthage was inevitable. And when the two finally clashed, the result was a series of wars so brutal that they would be remembered forever as the Punic Wars. The First Punic War began in 264 BCE. At its heart was Sicily, the rich island just south of Italy. Rome feared that if Carthage dominated Sicily, it could threaten Italy itself. But here's the problem. Carthage was a naval power, while Rome had almost no fleet. How could a land-based republic fight a maritime empire? The Romans did something extraordinary. They built a navy from scratch. Using a captured Carthaginian ship as a model, they constructed hundreds of warships. But the Romans didn't just copy, they innovated. They added a device called the corvus, a boarding bridge with a spike that could latch onto enemy ships, turning sea battles into land battles. And in land combat, the Romans always excelled. The war raged for more than 20 years, with victories and defeats on both sides. Carthage had experienced admirals, while Rome had determination and endless manpower. Finally, in 241 BCE, Rome defeated the Carthaginian fleet at the Battle of the Aegates Islands. Carthage was forced to surrender Sicily, marking Rome's first overseas province. Think about what that meant. In just 2 decades, Rome had gone from a regional Italian power to a Mediterranean empire. But Carthage was not finished. The Second Punic War, starting in 218 BCE, would become one of the most famous conflicts in history. This time, the Carthaginian general Hannibal took the stage. Brilliant, daring, and relentless, Hannibal struck Rome in a way no one expected. Instead of attacking by sea, he led his army on an incredible journey. He marched from Spain, across the Pyrenees, through Gaul, and over the Alps into Italy. Imagine it. Tens of thousands of soldiers, cavalry, and even war elephants climbing icy mountains, braving snowstorms and avalanches, only to descend into Italy, ready for battle. It was one of the most daring military feats of all time. Once in Italy, Hannibal proved unstoppable. At the Battle of Trebia, he crushed the Romans. At Lake Trasimene, he ambushed them and destroyed another army. And then came Cannae, in 216 BCE, one of the most devastating defeats in Roman history. Hannibal used a brilliant tactic, allowing the Roman army to push into his center, while his cavalry closed in from the sides. The result was a massacre. Tens of thousands of Romans were killed, their army annihilated. For a moment it seemed like Rome was finished. But here's the key. Rome refused to surrender. Unlike other states which might have negotiated or collapsed, Rome dug in. It avoided direct battles with Hannibal and focused instead on wearing him down. Roman generals like Fabius Maximus used delay tactics, harassing Hannibal's forces, cutting off supplies but never risking another disaster like Cannae. This strategy frustrated Hannibal, who found himself trapped in a long war he could not win. Meanwhile, Rome struck at Carthage's holdings elsewhere. In Spain, Roman armies fought to cut off Carthaginian reinforcements. And finally, in 214 BCE, the Roman general Scipio Africanus launched a daring invasion of North Africa. Carthage had no choice but to recall Hannibal from Italy. In 202 BCE, the two greatest generals of their age faced each other at the Battle of Zama. This time, Rome won. Scipio outmaneuvered Hannibal, neutralized his elephants, and crushed the Carthaginian army. Carthage surrendered once again, giving up its fleet and much of its territory. Rome had not only survived, it had become the dominant power in the Western Mediterranean. But Rome's rivalry with Carthage wasn't over. The Third Punic War, starting in 149 BCE, was shorter, but just as brutal. By this time, Carthage had recovered somewhat, and Roman politicians feared it might rise again. Voices like Cato the Elder demanded, Carthage must be destroyed. And Rome listened. In 146 BCE, Roman armies besieged Carthage itself. For 3 years, the city resisted with incredible courage. But Rome was relentless. When the walls were finally breached, the city was burned to the ground. Survivors were sold into slavery, and Carthage was erased from the map. It's a chilling moment in history. For generations, Carthage had been Rome's greatest rival, a city that nearly brought the Republic to its knees. But now, it was gone forever. Rome stood alone as the master of the Western Mediterranean. But let's step back for a moment. What did these wars mean for Rome? On one hand, they made Rome rich and powerful. Sicily, Spain, and North Africa became Roman provinces, supplying grain, silver, and resources. Rome also gained dominance at sea, securing its trade routes. On the other hand, the wars had consequences. They created a new kind of empire, one that relied on governors, taxes, and control over distant lands. They also changed Roman society. Wealth from conquered territories flowed into the hands of the elite, while ordinary farmers often struggled. Soldiers spent years away from their land, leading to poverty and unrest. And perhaps most importantly, the Punic Wars revealed something about Rome's character. Rome could be beaten in battle, even humiliated, but it could not be broken. Its strength came not just from its generals or its soldiers, but from its system, Rome's citizens, its alliances, and its stubborn will to fight again and again made it unstoppable. So, by 146 BCE, Rome had achieved something extraordinary. It had destroyed its greatest rival, secured the Western Mediterranean, and laid the foundation for future conquests. But here's the question. When you defeat every enemy around you, who do you fight next? The answer, as Rome would soon learn, was not always foreigners. Sometimes, the greatest battles come from within. By 200 BCE, Rome had defeated Carthage and secured the Western Mediterranean. But power never stays still. Once you've destroyed your greatest rival, what comes next? For the Romans, the answer was simple: expansion. And their next target was the Eastern Mediterranean, rich, cultured, and filled with kingdoms that traced their roots back to Alexander the Great. The spark for Rome's involvement in the East was Greece. At this time, Greece was not a united country. Instead, it was a patchwork of city-states and leagues, constantly competing for influence. Over them loomed powerful Hellenistic monarchies: Macedonia, the Seleucid Empire, and the Ptolemies in Egypt, all descendants of Alexander's generals. For centuries, these kingdoms had dominated the Eastern world. But Rome was about to change that balance forever. The first big clash came with Macedonia. In the Second Macedonian War, 200–197 BCE, Rome presented itself not as a conqueror, but as a liberator. The Romans claimed they were fighting to free the Greek cities from Macedonian domination. At the Battle of Cynocephalae in 197 BCE, the Roman legions proved their superiority over the Macedonian phalanx. It was a turning point in military history. The phalanx, with its long spears and rigid formations, had dominated battlefields since the days of Alexander. But the Roman manipular legion was more flexible, able to break apart and reform, adapting to the terrain. The result was clear. The old Greek way of war was finished. Rome was now the master of the battlefield. After the war, the Romans did something unusual. Instead of annexing Greece, they declared its freedom at the Isthmian Games in 196 BCE. Imagine the scene. A Roman general standing before a crowd of Greeks announcing that they were now free. The audience erupted in cheers, hailing Rome as a protector. But was it really freedom? Not exactly. Rome had no intention of leaving the East alone. It had simply found a clever way to appear generous while keeping control. Rome's ambitions soon clashed with another giant, the Seleucid Empire. In 192 BCE, Antiochus III, the Seleucid king, tried to extend his influence into Greece, but the Romans, claiming once again to defend Greek freedom, confronted him. At the Battle of Magnesia in 190 BCE, Rome and its allies crushed Antiochus's army. The Seleucids were forced to give up their ambitions in Greece and Asia Minor. Step by step, Rome was dismantling the old Hellenistic world. And then came Macedonia again. The Third Macedonian War erupted in 171 BCE, this time against King Perseus. At the Battle of Pydna in 168 BCE, Rome's legions once more destroyed the Macedonian phalanx. Perseus was captured, and Macedonia was divided into 4 client republics. The message was clear. Rome was no longer just a Western power. It was now the arbiter of Greece. But Greek freedom was an illusion. In 146 BCE, the same year Rome destroyed Carthage, it also crushed a Greek revolt led by the city of Corinth. The city was burned, its people enslaved, and Greece was formally brought under Roman control. 2 great civilizations, Carthage in the west and Greece in the east, had both fallen in the same year. Rome was now the undisputed master of the Mediterranean world. But Rome didn't stop with Greece. Its eyes turned to the wealthy kingdom of Pergamum in Asia Minor. In 133 BCE, the last king of Pergamum died without an heir, and in a surprising move, left his kingdom to Rome in his will. Just like that, Rome gained an enormous new province in the east, without even fighting a war. Now let's pause for a moment and ask, what did all this expansion mean for Rome itself? On the surface, it was triumph. Rome controlled more land than ever before. Wealth poured into the Republic: grain, gold, art, slaves. Roman generals marched home with treasures from Greece, filling their villas with statues and paintings. Roman temples were decorated with Greek architecture. Even Roman religion absorbed Greek gods, renaming them and making them part of Roman life. Have you ever wondered why Jupiter and Zeus, Venus and Aphrodite, Mars and Ares seem so similar? This is why. But beneath the glory, cracks were forming. Conquest created inequality. The rich grew richer, buying up huge estates called latifundia, worked by slaves taken from conquered lands. Meanwhile, small farmers, the backbone of Rome's army, struggled to compete. Many lost their land and moved into the city, swelling the ranks of the poor. The flood of wealth also corrupted politics. Senators and magistrates fought for control of provinces, where they could collect taxes and line their pockets. Ambitious generals sought glory abroad to boost their careers at home. The Republic's old balance between patricians and plebeians, between Senate and assemblies, was starting to break. And there's something else to notice. Rome's expansion into the East exposed it to new ideas, philosophies, and luxuries. Greeks brought not just art and science, but also new ways of thinking. Some Romans embraced this cultural exchange. Others feared it would weaken traditional Roman values of discipline and simplicity. Was Rome losing its soul even as it gained the world? That question would haunt Romans for centuries. So, by 133 BCE, Rome stood at its peak. It had destroyed Carthage, conquered Greece, humbled the great Hellenistic kingdoms, and inherited the wealth of Asia Minor. The Mediterranean was now a Roman lake. But this success came at a price. Inequality, corruption, and unrest were growing inside the Republic. And soon, men would rise who tried to fix these problems. Men like the Gracchi brothers. By 133 BCE, Rome ruled the Mediterranean. Carthage was gone, Greece was under control, and new provinces in Asia were pouring wealth into the city. From the outside, it looked like Rome had reached its golden age. But inside, something dangerous was happening. Rome's victories had created deep divisions, and those divisions were about to tear the Republic apart. Let's start with the land. Rome's conquests had filled Italy with slaves, millions of them. These slaves worked vast estates owned by wealthy senators, called latifundia. Meanwhile, ordinary Roman farmers who once formed the backbone of the army were struggling. Many had been away at war for years, only to return and find their farms ruined or bought out by the rich. Unable to compete with slave labor, they were forced into poverty, moving into Rome itself in search of work. The city grew crowded, chaotic, and restless. This crisis set the stage for two of the most famous reformers in Roman history, the brothers Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus. Tiberius Gracchus was elected tribune in 133 BCE. Looking at the growing inequality, he proposed something bold: to take land from the wealthy and redistribute it to poor citizens. His idea was simple: restore the small farmer, strengthen the republic. But the Senate, made up of the very elites who controlled the land, saw this as a threat to their power. A political battle erupted. Tiberius tried to bypass the Senate and take his reforms directly to the people. It was a daring move, but it made him enemies. In the end, violence won. Tiberius was attacked by a mob of senators and beaten to death in the streets. 10 years later, his younger brother Gaius Gracchus took up the cause. He expanded his brother's ideas: cheap grain for the poor, colonies for the landless, and even citizenship rights for some of Rome's Italian allies. Once again, the Senate resisted. Once again, conflict escalated, and once again, it ended in blood. Surrounded on the Aventine Hill, Gaius chose to take his own life rather than be captured. The Gracchi brothers were dead, but they had shown something new. Violence was now a tool of Roman politics. The old traditions of compromise and respect for the Republic's rules were crumbling. But land wasn't the only problem. Rome's army itself was changing. For centuries, only property-owning citizens could serve as soldiers. But with so many poor citizens losing their farms, the army's numbers were shrinking. In 107 BCE, a general named Gaius Marius introduced a radical reform. He allowed the landless poor to enlist. For them, the army was a chance at pay, plunder, and perhaps land after service. For Rome, it meant a steady supply of soldiers. But there was a catch. These new soldiers weren't loyal to the Republic, they were loyal to their generals, the men who promised them rewards. Can you see the danger? Armies would no longer fight for Rome itself, but for whoever commanded them. Marius himself rose to great fame. He defeated invading Germanic tribes like the Cimbri and Teutones, saving Rome from disaster. But his career also showed how personal ambition could disrupt politics. He held the consulship, Rome's highest office, an unprecedented 7 times, breaking all traditions. Ambition was replacing restraint. At the same time, Rome's Italian allies were growing restless. They had fought alongside Rome for centuries, providing soldiers and support, but they were denied citizenship. They paid taxes, they shed blood, but they weren't considered equals. Finally, their patience ran out. In 91 BCE, the social war erupted, with Rome's allies demanding full citizenship rights. It was a brutal conflict, fought across Italy, but in the end, Rome granted citizenship to its allies. The Republic survived, but at a cost. Now, Rome had extended citizenship across most of Italy, but the political system was straining under the weight of so many new citizens. As if that weren't enough, Ambitious generals were beginning to use their armies to seize political power. Marius clashed with another rising general, Lucius Cornelius Sulla. Their rivalry turned into open civil war. Sulla marched his army into Rome itself, the first time a Roman general had done so. It was a shocking moment, breaking one of the Republic's deepest taboos. After years of fighting, Sulla emerged victorious. He became dictator, rewrote the constitution to strengthen the Senate, and unleashed bloody proscriptions, lists of his enemies who were hunted down and killed. Sulla eventually stepped down, but the damage was done. He had shown that power could be taken by force and that the Republic's rules no longer held. And while Rome tore itself apart, another threat rose from within: slavery. Remember those millions of slaves working the latifundia? Some of them fought back. The most famous revolt came in 73 BCE, led by a gladiator named Spartacus. Starting with a small band of escaped slaves, Spartacus built an army of tens of thousands. For 2 years they roamed Italy, defeating Roman forces and terrifying the elite. At one point, it seemed they might even march on Rome itself. But eventually, Spartacus was defeated by the general Crassus, with help from Pompey. 6,000 captured slaves were crucified along the Appian Way as a warning. Think about what this means. Rome was the greatest power in the world, yet it was shaken by revolts, torn apart by civil wars, and governed by violence. The Republic was supposed to be about laws, shared power, and citizen rule. But by the mid-1st century BCE, it was increasingly about armies, wealth, and the ambitions of individuals. So, what does this tell us about Rome? On one hand, it was strong enough to survive crises, the Gracchi, the social war, Spartacus. On the other hand, each crisis left scars. Each time the Republic's traditions grew weaker, its politics more violent, and new figures were rising, men like Pompey, Crassus, and Julius Caesar, who would soon take Rome down an even darker path. By 73 BCE, Rome stood at a crossroads. It had survived enemies abroad and at home, but the Republic was crumbling. The question now was not whether Rome would fall, but whether it would transform. And that transformation would come with civil wars, dictators, and the end of the Republic itself. By 73 BCE, Rome was powerful, wealthy, and feared across the Mediterranean. But beneath the surface, the Republic was breaking apart. Violence had become a normal part of politics. Generals controlled private armies, and ambition mattered more than tradition. What followed was a century of chaos, civil wars, assassinations, and rivalries that would end with the Republic dead and the empire born. It all began with 3 men: Pompey, Crassus, and Julius Caesar. Pompey was Rome's most celebrated general. He had crushed piracy in the Mediterranean, cleared the seas for trade, and won victories in the east, expanding Rome's provinces. His soldiers adored him, and his name carried weight in every corner of the Republic. Crassus was the richest man in Rome, famous for putting down Spartacus's slave revolt. His money bought influence, and his ambition was limitless. Caesar, younger and less powerful, was a rising politician with charm, charisma, and an eye for glory. Together, these 3 formed an informal alliance, known later as the First Triumvirate. By combining wealth, military power, and political influence, they dominated Rome. But how long could 3 ambitious men share power? Caesar took command in Gaul in 58 BCE. For the next 8 years, he waged one of the most remarkable campaigns in history. He defeated tribes across modern-day France, crossed into Britain, and expanded Rome's reach further than ever before. His victories made him rich and famous, and his soldiers became fiercely loyal. While Caesar rose in Gaul, Pompey remained in Rome, managing politics, and Crassus went east to fight the Parthians. But in 53 BCE, disaster struck. At the Battle of Carrhae, Crassus was killed, his army destroyed. The triumvirate was broken. Now only 2 remained, Caesar and Pompey. It was only a matter of time before they clashed. Pompey aligned himself with the Senate, who feared Caesar's growing power. They ordered Caesar to give up his army and return to Rome. But Caesar knew that without his army, he would be powerless and vulnerable to his enemies. So, in 49 BCE, He made a decision that would change history. With a single legion, Caesar crossed the Rubicon River, the boundary of his province. By doing so, he declared war on the Republic itself. "Let the die be cast," Caesar is said to have remarked. And with that, the civil war began. Caesar marched swiftly into Italy. Pompey and the Senate fled to Greece, raising an army there. In 48 BCE, the two forces clashed at the Battle of Pharsalus. Despite being outnumbered, Caesar's veterans triumphed. Pompey fled to Egypt, but he never made it home. In a cruel twist, the young Egyptian king had Pompey murdered, hoping to win Caesar's favor. Instead, Caesar was horrified, weeping at the sight of his rival's severed head. Pompey was gone, and Caesar was the undisputed master of Rome. But Caesar's story didn't end there. In Egypt, he became entangled with Queen Cleopatra. Together, they formed a political and personal alliance, one that would echo throughout history. With her support, Caesar secured control of Egypt, adding yet another jewel to Rome's crown. Back in Rome, Caesar began reshaping the Republic. He passed laws to redistribute land, reformed the calendar into the one we still use today, and centralized power in his own hands. In 44 BCE, he was declared dictator for life. But here's the question: had Caesar gone too far? For centuries, Romans had prided themselves on rejecting kings. Was Caesar, in their eyes, becoming one? A group of senators thought so. On the Ides of March 15, 44 BCE, they struck. Led by Brutus and Cassius, men who claimed to be saving the Republic, they surrounded Caesar in the Senate and stabbed him 23 times. Caesar fell beneath the statue of Pompey, the man he had once defeated. His last words, according to legend, were, "Et tu, Brute." Whether true or not, the meaning was clear. Betrayal had killed him. The assassins thought they had saved the Republic. Instead, they plunged it into deeper chaos. Caesar's death left a power vacuum, and new rivals stepped forward. Mark Antony, Caesar's loyal ally, and Octavian, Caesar's adopted son and heir, barely 18 years old. At first, Antony and Octavian were enemies, but soon they realized they needed each other. Along with Lepidus, they formed the Second Triumvirate, officially dividing power between them. Their first act was vengeance. They hunted down Caesar's assassins, defeating Brutus and Cassius at the Battle of Philippi in 42 BCE. With the liberators dead, the triumvirate ruled supreme. But alliances never lasted in Rome. Lepidus was soon pushed aside, leaving Antony and Octavian. To strengthen their bond, Antony married Octavian's sister. But in the east, Antony fell under the spell of Cleopatra, just as Caesar had before him. Together, they dreamed of building a new empire, one that seemed to rival Rome itself. Octavian seized on this. He painted Antony as a traitor, a man who had abandoned Rome for a foreign queen. The stage was set for the final showdown. In 31 BCE, the two sides met at the naval battle of Actium. Octavian's forces, commanded by his admiral Agrippa, crushed Antony and Cleopatra's fleet. The lovers fled to Egypt, where, a year later, both took their own lives. With their deaths, the civil wars were over. Octavian was now the sole ruler of Rome. But what would he do with that power? Would he call himself king, emperor? Or would he preserve the shell of the Republic while holding all the power himself? The answer would define the next chapter of Roman history. Octavian would take the name Augustus, and under him, Rome would become an empire in all but name. So what can we take from this turbulent century? The Republic fell not because of one man, but because of a pattern. The Gracchi showed that politics could turn violent. Marius and Sulla showed that armies could decide power. Spartacus showed the dangers of slavery. Caesar showed the ambition of generals. And Antony and Octavian showed that civil wars end not with compromise, but with one man left standing. By 31 BCE, the Republic was gone, even if Romans didn't yet admit it. In its place rose something new, an empire ruled not by laws and traditions, but by a single leader with unmatched power. And that leader was Augustus. When Octavian defeated Antony and Cleopatra at Actium in 31 BCE, The long cycle of civil wars finally came to an end. For nearly a century, Rome had been torn apart by violence, rivalry, and ambition. But now, for the first time in generations, there was peace. And at the center of it all was one man, Octavian. The question was simple: what would he do with his power? Rome had always hated kings. The memory of the Tarquins, the last monarchs, still haunted the Republic. Caesar's murder proved how deeply Romans feared one-man rule. Octavian understood this better than anyone. He knew that if he wanted to rule, he could not appear to be a king. So he played a careful game. Outwardly, he restored the Republic, handing authority back to the Senate and keeping its institutions alive. But in reality, all power flowed through him. In 27 BCE, the Senate gave him a new title, Augustus. It meant the revered one. With that, Octavian became Augustus, the first emperor of Rome, though he never called himself that. He preferred princeps, or first citizen. The illusion was powerful. On paper, Rome was still a republic. In practice, Augustus held supreme authority. How did he secure it? First, he controlled the army. Rome's legions were no longer loyal to the Senate. They were loyal to their commander. Augustus ensured that only he and those he appointed could command them. No general could rise as Caesar or Pompey had once done. Second, he controlled wealth. He reorganized taxation, created a central treasury, and funded public works that reminded citizens of his generosity. Temples, theaters, roads, aqueducts. Rome itself became a monument to his rule. Third, he controlled image. Statues and coins depicted him as youthful, calm, and divine. Poets like Virgil and Horace wrote works that glorified his reign. Through propaganda, Augustus became not just a ruler, but a symbol of Rome's rebirth. And what a rebirth it was. The period that followed, known as the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, was one of stability and prosperity. For the first time in living memory, Rome was not at war with itself. Provinces were governed more effectively, trade flourished, and the Mediterranean truly became what Romans called Mare Nostrum, our sea. But Augustus was more than a politician. He was also a master of subtlety. He knew he could not govern by force alone. He presented himself as the restorer of tradition, reviving old Roman values of piety, discipline, and family. He reformed religion, rebuilding temples and reviving festivals. He claimed to be protecting Roman morality, even passing laws to encourage marriage and punish adultery. Behind this image of virtue, however, was a careful political strategy. By presenting himself as the guardian of tradition, Augustus made his rule seem natural, even necessary. Still, not everything was peaceful. Early in his reign, Augustus faced revolts and conspiracies. He crushed them quickly, making it clear that opposition would not be tolerated. In the provinces, his generals continued to expand Rome's borders into Spain, the Balkans, and parts of the Middle East. In 9 CE, however, disaster struck in Germany. 3 Roman legions, led by Varus, were ambushed in the Teutoburg forest by Germanic tribes. Nearly 20,000 soldiers were killed. When Augustus heard the news, he was said to have cried out, "Quinctilius Varus, give me back my legions." It was one of the few great defeats of his reign, and it marked the limit of Roman expansion in the north. Yet even this setback did not weaken Augustus's grip on power. He lived long enough to shape Rome in his image. By the time of his death in 14 CE, he had ruled for more than 40 years. He had outlived rivals, avoided the fate of Caesar, and created a system that would endure for centuries. So what made Augustus different? Why did he succeed where so many others failed? Perhaps it was his patience. He never rushed to take titles, never flaunted power openly. He wrapped absolute control in the clothing of tradition. He was ruthless when he needed to be, but always careful to appear modest. In doing so, he solved the central problem of Rome: how to have one man rule without calling him a king. When Augustus died, the Senate declared him a god. Temples were built in his honor, and he became part of Rome's official religion. For the Romans, he was not just a man, he was the founder of a new age. But what did this mean for Rome itself? On the surface, it meant peace and prosperity. Roads stretched from Britain to Syria. Aqueducts carried water into cities, and trade connected Rome with Africa, Asia, and Europe. Citizens enjoyed security, and Rome's culture thrived. Yet beneath this stability, the Republic was gone. Senators still debated, elections were still held, but they no longer mattered. Real power lay with the emperor. Rome had traded liberty for order, and most people accepted it. So, as we close this chapter, think about the transformation. Rome had been a republic for nearly 500 years, a state built on shared power and suspicion of kings. But in less than a generation, it became an empire ruled by one man. Was this a loss or a victory? Did Rome betray its old values, or did Augustus save it from self-destruction? Whatever the answer, one thing is certain. The Republic was gone, and the empire had begun. And with Augustus's death, a new question emerged. What happens when the throne passes to those who are not as wise, as patient, or as capable as he was? That's the story of the Julio-Claudian Dynasty, and it will show us how fragile even the greatest system can be. When Augustus died in 14 CE, Rome faced its first real test. Could the system he created survive without him? For nearly half a century, Augustus had balanced absolute power with the appearance of tradition. But now, the empire would pass to his family, the dynasty we call the Julio-Claudians. For the next 50 years, emperors from this line would shape Rome. Some brought stability, others chaos, and all revealed the dangers of giving so much power to one man. The first was Tiberius, Augustus's stepson. Tiberius was an experienced general, but he lacked Augustus's charm. Where Augustus had been careful and diplomatic, Tiberius was suspicious and cold. At first, he ruled competently, keeping the empire stable. But as the years went on, he withdrew from public life. He spent more and more time away from Rome, leaving the Senate uncertain and the people uneasy. Rumors spread of treason trials, executions, and paranoia. By the time Tiberius died in 37 CE, his reign left behind a sense of fear. Rome had survived, but its faith in emperors was shaken. And then came Caligula. At first, the people loved him. He was young, energetic, and the great-grandson of Augustus himself. For the first few months, he seemed like a blessing after the gloomy years of Tiberius. But then, something changed. Ancient sources describe Caligula as unstable, even mad. He demanded to be worshipped as a god while still alive. He staged extravagant games and drained the treasury with his spending. He humiliated senators, executed rivals, and ruled through fear. The most famous story, even if exaggerated, is that he planned to make his horse a consul. Whether true or not, it captured the sense of absurdity and terror in his reign. Finally, in 41 CE, his own guards assassinated him, ending 4 years of chaos. But the empire did not collapse. Instead, the guards turned to an unlikely figure, Claudius, Caligula's uncle. Claudius had never been taken seriously by the aristocracy. He limped, he stuttered, and many thought him weak. Yet once he became emperor, he proved surprisingly capable. Claudius expanded the empire into new territories, most famously conquering Britain in 43 CE. He reformed the administration, improved the legal system, and built aqueducts to supply Rome with water. But even Claudius's reign was not free from danger. He relied heavily on freedmen and his wives, creating intrigue in the palace. His final wife, Agrippina, persuaded him to adopt her son Nero as his heir. In 54 CE, Claudius died, possibly poisoned. The throne now passed to Nero, and Rome would enter one of its most infamous chapters. Nero began his reign at 16. At first, things looked promising. Guided by tutors like the philosopher Seneca, Nero showed interest in the arts and seemed to rule with moderation. But as he grew older, darker traits emerged. Nero saw himself not as a ruler, but as a performer. He sang, played the lyre, and even competed in athletic games, expecting Romans to cheer him like a celebrity. Meanwhile, his paranoia deepened. He executed his own mother, Agrippina, when she threatened his authority. He targeted senators and rivals, eliminating anyone who challenged him. Then came the Great Fire of Rome in 64 CE. Flames raged for days, destroying much of the city. Rumors spread that Nero himself had started the fire to clear land for his new palace, the Domus Aurea, or Golden House. Whether true or not, the suspicion damaged his reputation forever. To deflect blame, Nero turned on a small religious group, the Christians. He accused them of arson and launched the first great persecution of Christianity. Believers were executed, some burned alive, others torn apart in arenas. It was a moment that etched Nero's cruelty into history. As Nero's reign dragged on, unrest spread. Revolts erupted in the provinces, and even generals began to turn against him. In 68 CE, faced with rebellion and abandoned by his guards, Nero fled the city. Cornered, he took his own life. His final words, according to legend, were, "What an artist dies in me." With his death, the Julio-Claudian Dynasty ended. So what do we learn from these 50 years? The Julio-Claudians showed both the strengths and weaknesses of the empire. Under Augustus and Claudius, Rome was stable, expanding, and prosperous. Under Caligula and Nero, it was chaotic, paranoid, and violent. The system Augustus created worked, but only when the man in charge was competent. When he wasn't, the whole empire trembled. And this is the deeper lesson. The Republic had spread power across many hands. The empire placed it in one. That meant Rome's fate could rise or fall with the personality of a single emperor. Sometimes that man was wise, sometimes he was not. By 68 CE, Rome was once again on the edge of crisis. The throne was empty, the dynasty broken, and ambitious generals were marching toward the city. The empire was about to see something it had not faced since the days of the Republic. A year with multiple emperors fighting for control. The question was, who would win? And could Rome survive another cycle of civil war? When Nero died in 68 CE, he left no heir. For the first time since Augustus, the throne of Rome was empty. And when power is empty, someone always rushes to fill it. What followed was one of the most chaotic years in Roman history, the year of the four emperors. It began with Galba, an old general who seized power with the support of the Senate. But Galba was harsh and unpopular. After only 7 months, his own soldiers turned on him. He was murdered in the Forum, his head paraded through the streets. Next came Otho, who had helped orchestrate Galba's death. Otho promised generosity, but he faced a challenge immediately. In Germany, the legions had declared their own general, Vitellius, as emperor. The two sides clashed at the Battle of Bedriacum in northern Italy. Otho was defeated, and rather than prolong the war, he took his own life. For a brief moment, Vitellius reigned, but his rule was chaotic, marked by excess and brutality. And then came Vespasian, a seasoned general. Vespasian had been leading Rome's armies in the east, putting down the Jewish revolt in Judea. His soldiers proclaimed him emperor, and with the support of key allies, he marched on Rome. Vitellius tried to resist, but in December of 69 CE, he was killed by Vespasian's forces. At last, the chaos ended. The empire had a new dynasty, the Flavians. Vespasian was not born into nobility like Augustus or Nero. He came from a modest Italian background. Perhaps that was why he was pragmatic, practical, and deeply focused on stability. His first task was to rebuild Rome itself, which had suffered under fire, neglect, and civil war. One of his most lasting legacies was the beginning of construction on the Colosseum, or Flavian Amphitheater. Funded partly with the spoils of victory from Judea, the Colosseum symbolized Rome's power and provided entertainment for the people. Gladiator games, wild beast hunts, and naval mock battles would all take place there. Even today, the Colosseum stands as a monument to his dynasty. But Vespasian also had to deal with unrest across the empire. In Judea, the Jewish revolt continued. His son Titus led the campaign that culminated in the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 CE. The city was besieged, its walls breached, and the Second Temple destroyed. For Jews, it was a tragedy remembered for centuries. For Rome, it was a triumph. The spoils from Jerusalem were paraded in Rome, and Titus would later commemorate the victory with the Arch of Titus, still standing today. Vespasian ruled for 10 years, bringing stability, financial reform, and rebuilding. When he died in 79 CE, he left behind something rare in Rome, an orderly succession. His son Titus became emperor. Titus had already proven himself as a general in Judea, but as emperor, he faced new challenges. Just months into his reign, disaster struck. Mount Vesuvius erupted, burying the cities of Pompeii and Herculaneum under ash and lava. Thousands were killed. Entire communities erased in a single day. Titus organized relief efforts, sending aid and officials to help survivors. His generosity won him admiration, even in the face of catastrophe. And then, another disaster. In 80 CE, a massive fire swept through Rome, destroying large parts of the city. Once again, Titus responded with aid and reconstruction. Despite these crises, or perhaps because of how he handled them, Titus became beloved. The Colosseum, begun under his father, was completed and inaugurated during his reign, with games that lasted 100 days. Yet Titus's rule was short. After only 2 years as emperor, he fell ill and died in 81 CE. Some whispered that he was poisoned by his brother Domitian, though no proof existed. Whether true or not, Domitian now became emperor. Domitian's reign would last 15 years, the longest of the Flavians. He was efficient, ambitious, and determined to strengthen the empire. He fortified borders, especially along the Rhine and Danube, where Germanic tribes threatened Rome. He reorganized the economy, restored Roman coinage, and promoted massive building projects. For much of his reign, the empire was stable and prosperous. But Domitian's personality turned many against him. He demanded to be addressed as Lord and God, something that disturbed senators who remembered Rome's hatred of kingship. He grew increasingly suspicious, ruling with fear and ordering executions of those he distrusted. Historians describe him as paranoid, and whether or not all accounts are fair, his rule left many feeling oppressed. In 96 CE, a palace conspiracy ended his life. Court officials assassinated Domitian, and with him the Flavian Dynasty came to an end. So what do we make of the Flavians? They came to power in chaos and restored stability. They gave Rome the Colosseum, rebuilt the city, and secured the empire's borders. But their reign also revealed the ongoing problem of succession. Unlike Augustus, who built a dynasty carefully, the Flavians rose suddenly and fell just as quickly. Rome had survived another test, but the cycle of good emperors and bad emperors continued. And perhaps that is the key theme of this era. The empire was strong enough to endure weak rulers, disasters, and even civil war. But its stability depended on the character of whoever sat on the throne. Sometimes Rome was lucky, with men like Vespasian and Titus. Sometimes it was not, with emperors like Domitian. By the end of the Flavian dynasty, Rome was once again searching for leadership. The man who came next would usher in one of the most celebrated periods in Roman history, the age of the 5 good emperors. But how long could good fortune last? When Domitian was assassinated in 96 CE, Rome was once again at a crossroads. The Flavian dynasty had ended, and the empire needed a new leader. But instead of chaos, something remarkable happened. For the next 80 years, Rome was ruled by a series of emperors remembered as the 5 good emperors: Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and Marcus Aurelius. Their reigns brought stability, prosperity, and expansion, marking one of the high points of Roman civilization. It began with Nerva, an elderly senator chosen after Domitian's death. Nerva was not a warrior or a conqueror. Instead, he was a compromise, a man meant to calm fears and restore trust after years of paranoia under Domitian. Nerva limited his power, released political prisoners, and tried to reconcile with the Senate. But his greatest act was one of foresight. Realizing his age and weakness, he adopted a younger, capable general as his heir, Trajan. This decision would set a precedent, choosing successors not by blood but by merit. Trajan became emperor in 98 CE, and under him, Rome reached its greatest territorial extent. Trajan was a soldier's emperor, respected by his legions and admired by the people. He expanded the empire into Dacia, a rich land north of the Danube, roughly modern-day Romania. The conquest was brutal, but it brought enormous wealth to Rome. So much gold that it funded massive building projects back in the capital. The most famous of these was Trajan's Forum, complete with Trajan's Column, which still stands today, spiraling upward with carvings that tell the story of his victories. But Trajan didn't stop at Dacia. He pushed further east, launching a campaign against the Parthian Empire. His armies captured Armenia, Mesopotamia, and even reached the Persian Gulf. For a moment, it seemed Rome was unstoppable. Yet holding such vast lands proved difficult. Rebellions flared and Trajan's health declined. In 117 CE, as he prepared to return to Rome, he died. But before his death, he too adopted a successor, Hadrian. Hadrian was very different from Trajan. Where Trajan was a conqueror, Hadrian was a consolidator. He believed the empire had reached its natural limits and should focus on defense, not expansion. To secure the frontiers, he built fortifications, most famously Hadrian's Wall in northern Britain, a stone barrier that marked the edge of the Roman world. Hadrian also traveled extensively, visiting nearly every province to strengthen administration and connect personally with his subjects. Culturally, Hadrian left a huge mark on Rome itself. He completed the Pantheon, one of the most iconic buildings of the ancient world, with its massive dome and oculus. He also built his Grand Villa outside Rome, a vast complex filled with art and architecture from across the empire. Hadrian was also a man of philosophy and learning, admired by Greek intellectuals, but his reign was not free of conflict. In Judea, a massive revolt erupted in 132 CE, led by Simon Bar Kokhba. The rebellion was fierce, lasting 3 years. When it ended, Judea was devastated, its people scattered, and Jerusalem refounded as a Roman colony. Hadrian died in 138 CE, and once again, succession was peaceful. His choice was Antoninus Pius, who would rule for 23 years. Antoninus's reign was one of quiet stability. He avoided major wars, focused on internal improvements, and became known for his fairness and dedication. Under him, the empire prospered. Laws were refined, taxes were managed carefully, and the people enjoyed a long period of peace. Few emperors in history have had such a calm and steady reign, and that stability earned him the name Pius. When Antoninus died in 161 CE, power passed to Marcus Aurelius, the last of the 5 good emperors. Marcus is remembered not only as a ruler, but also as a philosopher. His writings, later collected as Meditations, reveal a man deeply concerned with duty, morality, and the meaning of life. He ruled with wisdom and humility, embodying the Stoic ideals he cherished. But his reign was far from peaceful. Almost immediately, he faced wars on the frontiers. In the east, Rome clashed once again with the Parthians. In the north, Germanic tribes threatened the Danube frontier, forcing Marcus to spend much of his reign on campaign. Even worse, during his rule, a terrible plague, possibly smallpox, swept through the empire, killing millions and weakening its strength. Despite these challenges, Marcus Aurelius remained steadfast, ruling with a sense of duty that earned him admiration even in hard times. Yet Marcus made one decision that would haunt the empire. Breaking the tradition of adoption, he named his biological son Commodus as heir. When Marcus died in 180 CE, Rome had enjoyed nearly a century of wise rule. But with Commodus, everything would change. So what do we take from this golden age? The 5 good emperors proved that Rome could thrive when rulers were chosen for ability, not blood. They expanded and secured the empire, reformed laws, built enduring monuments, and gave Rome peace and prosperity. But they also revealed the fragility of the system. Everything depended on the character of the man at the top, and when that man was no longer wise or good, the empire's stability would collapse. By 180 CE, Rome stood at its height. Its borders stretched from Britain to Mesopotamia, from the Sahara to the Rhine. Its cities flourished, its culture dazzled, and its armies stood strong. But the death of Marcus Aurelius marked the end of the Golden Age. With Commodus, Rome would step into decline, and the crises of the 3rd century were already waiting just beyond the horizon. When Marcus Aurelius died in 180 CE, he left behind a vast, powerful empire. But he also left behind something else: his son Commodus, a young man utterly unlike the philosopher-emperor who had come before him. With Commodus, the age of the 5 good emperors ended, and Rome began a slow slide into crisis. At first, Commodus was celebrated. He was the son of a beloved ruler, and his succession meant stability. But it quickly became clear he was not cut from the same cloth as his father. While Marcus Aurelius had spent his life in military camps, writing stoic reflections and bearing the burdens of empire, Commodus had little interest in duty. He craved luxury, spectacle, and above all, personal glory. Commodus styled himself as a living god. He appeared in the arena dressed as Hercules, fighting wild animals and even gladiators. For the people of Rome, this was shocking. Gladiators were slaves and criminals, the lowest of the low. For the emperor to join their ranks blurred the lines of honor and dignity, but Commodus relished the adoration of the crowds. He renamed Rome itself Colonia Commodiana, the colony of Commodus, and renamed months of the year after his own titles. Meanwhile, real governance suffered. The Senate despised him, generals distrusted him, and conspiracies multiplied. He executed rivals, trusted corrupt favorites, and drained the treasury with endless spectacles. Eventually, even those closest to him had enough. On New Year's Eve in 192 CE, Commodus was assassinated in his bath. His death ended the Antonine Dynasty and threw Rome back into civil war. What followed was another year of the emperors. In 193 CE alone, 5 different men claimed the throne. First came Pertinax, a respected senator, but he lasted only 3 months before being murdered by the Praetorian Guard, the emperor's supposed protectors. Then came Didius Julianus, who literally bought the throne at auction, paying the guard to declare him emperor. His rule was short and despised, and soon generals across the provinces rose up against him. From this chaos emerged Septimius Severus, a commander from North Africa. With the support of his legions, he marched on Rome, overthrew Julianus, and established the Severan dynasty. Severus was ruthless but effective. He strengthened the army, increased soldiers' pay, and expanded Rome's frontiers in the east and in Britain. He declared openly that the army, not the Senate, was the true foundation of imperial power. Pay the soldiers and ignore everyone else, he supposedly advised his sons. For a time, Severus stabilized the empire, but his policies carried consequences. By raising military pay, he placed heavy strain on the treasury. To cover costs, taxes increased, and currency was debased. The army grew ever more powerful, while civilian institutions declined. The balance Augustus had created centuries earlier tilted dangerously toward military rule. When Severus died in 211 CE, power passed to his 2 sons, Caracalla and Geta. The brothers hated each other, and within months Caracalla had Geta murdered. From then on, Caracalla ruled alone, remembered as both brutal and ambitious. He extended Roman citizenship to nearly all free inhabitants of the empire, a move that broadened Rome's tax base, but also diluted the old distinction between Roman citizens and provincials. Yet Caracalla is best known for his cruelty. He ordered massacres, executed rivals, and drained resources on massive building projects like the Baths of Caracalla, still visible in Rome today. In 217 CE, he was assassinated by one of his own soldiers. After Caracalla, the Severan dynasty struggled to hold power. Macrinus, a Praetorian prefect, briefly became emperor, but he was overthrown by forces loyal to the Severan family. Next came Elagabalus, a teenage priest of Assyrian sun god. His reign shocked Romans with its eccentricity and disregard for tradition. He introduced foreign religious practices, married multiple times, including to a Vestal virgin, and indulged in scandalous behavior. The Senate despised him, and in 222 CE, he was murdered by the Praetorian Guard. His cousin Severus Alexander replaced him. Young but guided by his mother and advisors, Alexander tried to restore stability. He reined in extravagance, promoted law and order, and attempted to negotiate with foreign enemies. But the empire's challenges were mounting. On the frontiers, Germanic tribes grew bolder, while in the east, the powerful Sasanian Persians rose as a new rival. In 235 CE, during a campaign against Germanic tribes, Alexander was assassinated by his own troops. With his death, the Severan dynasty ended, and Rome plunged into a new and even greater crisis. So, what do we see in this 50-year period? The golden age of Marcus Aurelius had given way to chaos. Emperors rose and fell with alarming speed. The army, once the servant of the state, had become its master, deciding who would rule. Wealth was strained, borders were threatened, and politics grew unstable. The Severan dynasty managed to keep Rome intact, but their reliance on the military and disregard for tradition weakened the empire's foundations. By 235 CE, Rome was about to enter its darkest century yet, a period historians call the crisis of the 3rd century. Civil wars, invasions, plagues, and economic collapse would push the empire to the brink of destruction. When Severus Alexander was assassinated in 235 CE, Rome entered a period unlike anything it had faced before. For nearly 300 years, the empire had been powerful, wealthy, and dominant. But in the 50 years that followed, it almost came apart completely. Historians call this the crisis of the 3rd century, a time when everything seemed to go wrong at once. The first problem was leadership. With Alexander's death, the throne was no longer secure. Generals rose and fell with alarming speed, proclaimed emperor by their soldiers only to be killed in battle or assassinated soon after. In less than 50 years, Rome saw more than 20 emperors, many ruling for only a year or two. This rapid turnover made stability impossible. Each new ruler promised to restore Rome's strength, but few lasted long enough to make real change. The second problem was invasion. Rome's borders, once secure, were collapsing. In the east, a new power emerged, the Sasanian Persians. Fierce and ambitious, they struck deep into Roman territory. In 260 CE, the Roman Emperor Valerian was captured alive by the Persian king Shapur. France, the only time in Rome's history that an emperor was taken prisoner. Valerian was humiliated, forced to serve as a living trophy. Some sources even claim he was used as a human footstool before being executed. For Rome, it was a devastating blow. In the north, Germanic tribes like the Goths, Alemanni, and Franks pushed across the Rhine and Danube, raiding deep into Roman lands. Cities were burned, provinces devastated. At one point, the Franks even reached Spain and threatened to cross into North Africa. The empire's frontiers were crumbling. The third problem was internal division. With the central government weak, local leaders began to break away. In the west, the so-called Gallic Empire formed, including Gaul, Britain, and parts of Spain. In the east, the wealthy city of Palmyra, under Queen Zenobia, declared independence and controlled much of the eastern provinces, including Egypt. For a time, the Roman Empire was split into 3 parts, each ruled separately. And then came the fourth problem, the economy. Endless wars drained the treasury. To pay soldiers, emperors debased the currency, mixing less silver into coins. Inflation skyrocketed, prices soared, trade collapsed, and people lost faith in money itself. Combined with plagues that swept through the empire, killing millions, daily life became a struggle for survival. So how did Rome survive this chaos? The answer lies in resilience and in the occasional rise of capable emperors. One of the first was Gallienus, who ruled during the height of the crisis. He reorganized the army, creating a mobile cavalry force to respond quickly to invasions. He also promoted talented men based on ability, not just noble birth. His reforms gave Rome breathing space, even if he could not stop all the empire's troubles. Later came Aurelian, known as Restorer of the World. Between 270 and 275 CE, he achieved the impossible. He defeated the Goths, restored control of the Danube frontier, and then marched east to crush Queen Zenobia's Palmyrene Empire. Captured and paraded in Rome, Zenobia symbolized the return of unity. Aurelian then turned west, defeating the Gallic Empire and bringing Gaul and Britain back under Roman control. For the first time in decades, the empire was whole again. He even began building massive new walls around Rome itself, the Aurelian walls, to defend the capital from invasion. But even Aurelian could not escape the curse of the 3rd century. In 275 CE, he was assassinated by his own officers. The cycle of instability continued. Still, the crisis could not last forever. By the 280s, one final strong leader emerged, Diocletian. In 284 CE, he seized power and began the most sweeping reforms Rome had ever seen. But his story belongs to the next chapter. So what can we take from the crisis of the 3rd century? First, that even the greatest empires can be fragile. Rome looked invincible after centuries of dominance, but within a few decades it nearly disintegrated. Second, that Rome's strength lay not just in its armies, but in its ability to adapt. New generals, new tactics, and sheer determination allowed it to survive. And finally, that survival came at a cost. The Rome that emerged after the crisis was not the same Rome as before. Its economy was weaker, its borders less secure, and its government increasingly authoritarian. By 284 CE, Rome had survived, but just barely. The question now was whether it could rebuild. And that challenge would fall to Diocletian, the man who would reshape the empire and set it on a new path. By 284 CE, the Roman Empire was battered, scarred, and nearly broken. 50 years of civil wars, invasions, plagues, and economic collapse had pushed it to the brink of destruction. But Rome did not fall. Instead, it found a savior, an emperor who would rebuild the state from the ground up. His name was Diocletian, and his reforms would change the empire forever. Diocletian was not born into nobility. He came from a humble background in Dalmatia on the Adriatic coast, and rose through the army by skill and determination. Perhaps it was this background that gave him a clear view of Rome's problems. He understood that the old ways no longer worked. The empire was too large, too threatened, and too unstable to be ruled as it had been before. If Rome was to survive, it needed something new. The first challenge was leadership. For decades, emperors had risen and fallen through violence. No single man could control the empire alone. Not anymore. Diocletian's solution was radical. He created the Tetrarchy, or Rule of Four. In 293 CE, he divided power between two senior emperors, called Augusti, and two junior emperors, called Caesaris. Diocletian himself ruled the eastern provinces, while his colleague Maximian ruled the west. Each had a junior partner who could succeed them when the time came. In theory, this system solved two problems. It allowed the empire to be governed more efficiently, and it created a clear line of succession to prevent civil war. The Tetrarchy was more than a political idea. It was a new vision of power. The emperors were no longer seen as first among equals, like Augustus had styled himself. Instead, they were elevated above ordinary men. Diocletian emphasized ceremony, distance, and majesty. He wore elaborate robes, demanded subjects bow before him, and surrounded himself with ritual. The emperor was no longer just a leader. He was something close to divine. But Diocletian knew ceremony was not enough. The empire's survival depended on the army. He reorganized the legions, splitting them into border troops and mobile field armies. This allowed Rome to defend its long frontiers more effectively against constant raids by Persians, Goths, and other tribes. He also expanded the army's size, ensuring that no single invasion could overwhelm it. To pay for this, he restructured the tax system, making it more efficient and far-reaching. Taxes were assessed based on land, people, and productivity, providing a steadier flow of revenue to fund the state. Yet these changes were hard on ordinary Romans. Taxes became heavier, and strict rules bound farmers to their land, tying labor to estates in ways that foreshadowed medieval serfdom. The economy was managed more tightly than ever, with prices fixed by law and trade controlled. Diocletian was not trying to make life easier. He was trying to keep the empire alive, Religion, too, became a tool of stability. Diocletian saw the traditional Roman gods as essential to the empire's unity. When Christians refused to worship them, he saw it as dangerous disloyalty. In 303 CE, he launched the Great Persecution, the harshest attack on Christians in Roman history. Churches were destroyed, scriptures burned, and believers imprisoned or executed. For Diocletian, it was about order and obedience, but instead of crushing Christianity, the persecution only strengthened it, creating martyrs whose stories inspired future generations. Despite the harshness of his rule, Diocletian achieved what few before him had managed: stability. Invasions were repelled, the economy was restored, and the government was stronger than it had been in centuries. The empire was no longer on the brink of collapse. It had been remade into something tougher, more centralized and more authoritarian. And then came one of the most surprising acts in Roman history. In 305 CE, after 20 years of rule, Diocletian voluntarily stepped down. He retired to his palace in Split in modern Croatia, tending to his gardens. Imagine that, after centuries of emperors fighting to hold on to power until death, Diocletian simply let go. He left the empire in the hands of his tetrarchy, confident that his system would endure. But of course, nothing in Rome ever lasted forever. The tetrarchy soon collapsed into new rivalries and civil wars. Yet Diocletian's legacy remained. He had shown that Rome could survive its greatest crisis by changing itself. The empire that came after him was not the same as the one Augustus had built. It was more rigid, more authoritarian and less free, but it was alive. So what do we learn from Diocletian's reign? That survival often requires sacrifice. Rome gave up much of its old identity, the illusions of the Republic, the idea of shared power, even some of its economic freedom, in exchange for stability. And while Diocletian's system could not prevent future struggles, it bought Rome another century of life in the West, and much longer in the East. By the time Diocletian retired, the empire was transformed. But the question was, who would carry it forward? The answer was a man who would take Rome in a new direction entirely: Constantine. With him, the empire would embrace a new capital, a new faith, and a new identity. The Roman world was about to change again, in ways even Diocletian could not have imagined. When Diocletian retired in 305 CE, he believed he had secured the empire's future. His system of the tetrarchy, 2 senior emperors and 2 juniors, was meant to ensure stability. But almost as soon as he stepped down, it unraveled. Rivalries flared, alliances collapsed, and civil wars broke out once again. Amid this chaos, one man would rise above all others. His name was Constantine, and under his reign, the empire would change forever. Constantine's path to power began in 306 CE, when his father, Constantius, a senior emperor of the West, died while campaigning in Britain. The legions immediately proclaimed Constantine emperor, but others claimed the throne too, including Maxentius in Rome and several Eastern rulers. For years, the empire was divided among rival emperors, each fighting for supremacy. The decisive moment came in 312 CE, at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, just outside Rome. Constantine marched against Maxentius, who controlled the city. On the eve of battle, according to Christian sources, Constantine experienced a vision. He saw a sign in the sky, either a cross of light or the letters Chi Rho, the first symbols of Christ's name, with the words, "In this sign, you will conquer." Constantine ordered his soldiers to mark the symbol on their shields. The next day, his army defeated Maxentius, who drowned in the Tiber as his forces fled. Constantine entered Rome victorious, convinced that his victory had come through the power of the Christian God. From that moment, Constantine's relationship with Christianity would shape his rule. In 313 CE, he and his co-emperor Licinius issued the Edict of Milan, granting religious tolerance throughout the empire. For the first time, Christians could worship openly without fear of persecution. Churches were built, property restored, and Christianity began its rise from a persecuted sect to a religion of power and prestige. But Constantine was not only a patron of Christianity, he was also a shrewd politician. He knew the empire needed more than religious reform. He reorganized the government, strengthening imperial authority and centralizing power. He reformed the army, securing the frontiers, and stabilized the currency, restoring confidence in Rome's economy. Most dramatically, Constantine founded a new capital. In 324 CE, after defeating Licinius and becoming sole ruler of the empire, he chose the city of Byzantium on the Bosporus as his new seat of power. Renamed Constantinople, the city of Constantine, it was strategically placed between Europe and Asia, commanding trade routes and better positioned to defend against Eastern threats. Built with Roman architecture, forums, and palaces, but infused with Christian symbols, Constantinople symbolized the transformation of the empire itself. Rome was no longer just the city on the Tiber, it was an empire with a new center. Christianity, too, continued to grow under Constantine's guidance. He gave bishops privileges, funded the construction of great churches like the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, and involved himself in religious debates. In 325 CE, he convened the Council of Nicaea, bringing together bishops from across the empire to settle disputes about Christian doctrine. The result was the Nicene Creed, a statement of faith still used in churches today. Constantine was not baptized until shortly before his death, but his reign marked the turning point. Christianity had moved from the margins to the heart of imperial life. Yet Constantine's reign was not free from contradiction. He promoted Christianity, but he also continued to honor traditional Roman gods, at least publicly, for much of his rule. He preached peace but did not hesitate to kill rivals, even members of his own family when he felt threatened. His legacy is complex. Was he a true believer, a pragmatic ruler, or both? Perhaps that mystery is part of why he remains one of history's most fascinating figures. What cannot be denied is the scale of his impact. Under Constantine, the empire was reunited under one ruler. Its capital was moved to Constantinople, a city that would endure for 1,000 years after the fall of Rome itself. And most importantly, Christianity was placed on the path to becoming the empire's official religion. When Constantine died in 337 CE, he was buried in the Church of the Holy Apostles in Constantinople, surrounded by 12 empty tombs representing the apostles of Christ. In death, he presented himself not just as an emperor, but as the 13th apostle, a bridge between Rome and the faith that would define it. So what do we make of Constantine's reign? He was a warrior, a builder, and a visionary. He saved the empire from disintegration, but in doing so, he transformed it into something new. The old pagan Rome of Augustus and Trajan was fading. Christian Rome was rising. And while that brought new strength, it also created new challenges. What would happen when the empire was ruled not just by emperors, but by faith? That question would be answered in the generations after Constantine. His sons would inherit a divided empire, and Christianity would become not just tolerated, but official. But alongside unity came new struggles, conflicts between pagans and Christians, between rival Christian factions, and between emperors themselves. The empire had survived the 3rd century crisis. It had been remade by Diocletian, and it had been reborn under Constantine. But its challenges were far from over. The next chapter would bring new rulers, new religions, and eventually, a permanent division between East and West. When Constantine died in 337 CE, he left behind a transformed empire. The capital had shifted to Constantinople, Christianity had risen to prominence, and the old order of pagan Rome was fading. But Constantine also left behind a problem: succession. He had 3 sons, each eager to rule, and in Rome, whenever there were multiple heirs, conflict was never far away. After his death, Constantine's empire was divided among his sons: Constantine II, Constantius II, and Constans. At first it seemed the arrangement might hold, but within a few years, civil war broke out. Constantine II tried to claim more territory, only to be killed in battle. Constans and Constantius II then ruled together, one in the west, the other in the east. But rivalry soon flared again. In 350 CE, Constans was overthrown and killed by a usurper, Magnentius. Constantius, determined to rule alone, defeated Magnentius at the Battle of Mursa Major, one of the bloodiest battles Rome had ever seen. By 353 CE, Constantius II was sole emperor. Constantius II was a devout Christian, but his reign revealed the new challenges of a Christian empire. Christianity was no longer a small, persecuted sect. It was now a powerful force, but it was also divided. Disputes over doctrine, especially the nature of Christ, split believers into rival factions. Constantius tried to enforce unity, but his involvement often deepened the divisions. The old religious tolerance of pagan Rome was fading, replaced by bitter struggles between Christians themselves. When Constantius died in 361 CE, the throne passed to his cousin Julian, remembered in history as Julian the Apostate. Unlike Constantine and Constantius, Julian rejected Christianity. He attempted to revive traditional Roman religion, restoring temples and promoting pagan philosophy. Julian was brilliant, a philosopher-emperor who dreamed of bringing back the old gods. But his reign was short. In 363 CE, during a campaign against Persia, he was mortally wounded. With his death, his pagan revival collapsed. Christianity's rise could no longer be stopped. After Julian, new rulers came and went, but one emperor stood out: Theodosius I, rising to power in 379 CE. Theodosius faced both external enemies and internal divisions. On the frontiers, the Goths had grown stronger, pressing into Roman territory after fleeing from invading Huns. In 378 CE, just before Theodosius took the throne, the Eastern Emperor Valens had been killed at the Battle of Adrianople, where Gothic cavalry crushed a Roman army. The shock of Adrianople showed that Rome could no longer take its military superiority for granted. Inside the empire, Theodosius made choices that shaped the future of Rome forever. Unlike Julian, Theodosius was a committed Christian. In 380 CE, he issued the Edict of Thessalonica, declaring Christianity the official religion of the empire. From then on, all Roman citizens were expected to follow the Nicene Creed. Pagan temples were closed, sacrifices banned, and Christianity became deeply tied to imperial power. For centuries, Rome had defined itself through its gods: Jupiter, Mars, Venus. Now, it was defining itself through Christ. Theodosius also showed how the balance of power was shifting between emperors and the church. After a massacre in Thessalonica, where thousands were killed on his orders, Theodosius was publicly rebuked by Bishop Ambrose of Milan. Instead of punishing the bishop, Theodosius submitted, doing penance before returning to power. It was a moment that symbolized a new reality. Even emperors were now accountable to Christian leaders. By the end of Theodosius's reign, one more change had come. In 395 CE, the empire was divided permanently between his two sons, Arcadius in the east and Honorius in the west. For centuries, the empire had been split and reunited, east and west working together under one emperor. But now, the division was final. The Eastern Empire, with its capital at Constantinople, would endure for another 1,000 years. The Western Empire, weaker and poorer, would face mounting pressures that it could not withstand. So what does this period show us? First, that Constantine's legacy was both powerful and unstable. He had elevated Christianity, but his heirs turned faith into a battlefield of politics. He had created a new capital, but his dynasty divided the empire, and he had left Rome strong. But the Goths at Adrianople showed that external threats were growing stronger. The Constantinian dynasty and its successors proved that Rome could adapt again and again, but they also revealed that each adaptation came with new challenges. By 395 CE, Rome was no longer the same empire Augustus had built. It was Christian, it was divided, and its survival depended on emperors who often seemed more fragile than strong. In 395 CE, when Theodosius III died, he left the Roman Empire to his two sons. Arcadius inherited the eastern half, with its capital at Constantinople. Honorius received the western half, with its capital in Milan, later Ravenna. For centuries, the empire had been divided and reunited, sometimes ruled by multiple emperors, sometimes by one. But this time was different. The division was permanent. From now on, the Roman Empire would always be two empires, East and West. At first glance, the split seemed practical. The empire was vast, too large for one man to govern. The East and West had different strengths and different challenges. The Eastern Empire was wealthier, with flourishing cities, strong trade routes, and defensible borders along the Danube and the Persian frontier. Constantinople itself was a marvel, strategically located between Europe and Asia, heavily fortified, and growing into one of the greatest cities of the ancient world. The Western Empire, by contrast, was weaker. Its cities were smaller, its economy less developed, and its borders stretched thin across Gaul, Spain, and Britain. Its capital, first Milan and later Ravenna, lacked the grandeur and strategic advantages of Constantinople. Worse, the West faced constant invasions from Germanic tribes pressing against the Rhine and Danube. The difference between the two halves became clear almost immediately. In the East, Arcadius's court was dominated by powerful ministers and church officials, but the empire remained relatively stable. In the West, Honorius's reign was marked by disaster after disaster. The first blow came from the Visigoths. These Germanic tribes had entered the empire years earlier, fleeing from the terrifying advance of the Huns. Theodosius had settled them as allies, but after his death tensions rose. In 410 CE, under their king Alaric, the Visigoths marched into Italy and sacked Rome itself. For the first time in 800 years, the Eternal City was taken by foreign enemies. The shock reverberated across the world. How could Rome, once the master of nations, fall to barbarians? In truth, the sack of 410 was more symbolic than destructive. Rome was no longer the political heart of the empire. The capital of the West had already moved north. But psychologically, it was devastating. It showed that Rome could be violated, that the empire was no longer invincible. Meanwhile, the East endured. Constantinople, protected by its massive walls, stood firm against threats. Its wealth and population allowed it to recover quickly from crises. Its emperors, though sometimes weak, benefited from strong institutions and the growing power of the Church. The East was evolving into what we now call the Byzantine Empire, a state that was Roman in name but increasingly Greek in culture and Christian in identity. The West, however, was spiraling downward. In Britain, Roman authority collapsed as legions withdrew, leaving the province to fend for itself against Saxon raids. In Gaul and Spain, Germanic tribes established kingdoms of their own. In North Africa, the Vandals crossed into Roman territory, eventually creating a powerful state that controlled the empire's grain supply. And yet the division was not only about weakness and strength, it was also about identity. The Eastern Empire increasingly saw itself as the true heir of Rome, with its capital in Constantinople and its faith in Christianity. The Western Empire clung to the old traditions, but could not stop the tide of change. Paganism lingered longer in the West, but Christianity was spreading rapidly, especially after Theodosius had made it the official religion. Bishops and church leaders became as powerful as generals, guiding the people when emperors could not. So why did the East survive while the West declined? Geography played a role. Constantinople was nearly impregnable, while Italy and Gaul were exposed to constant invasions. Wealth was another factor. The East had richer provinces, stronger trade networks, and a more urban population. The West, heavily reliant on agriculture and stretched across vast rural territories, struggled to raise the taxes needed to defend itself. But perhaps the greatest difference was leadership. The East often found capable rulers and administrators who managed to keep the state intact. The West suffered from weak emperors, many of them young, manipulated by generals or court officials. Honorius, for example, spent much of his reign secluded in Ravenna, protected by marshes but isolated from the real problems of the empire. The permanent division of 395 did not mean the two halves ignored each other. They were still bound by family ties, diplomacy, and sometimes military cooperation. But increasingly they lived separate lives. The East focused on survival against Persia and later the Huns. The West struggled simply to keep its provinces from falling apart. By the middle of the 5th century, the consequences were clear. The Eastern Empire was adapting, reforming its army, and building the defenses of Constantinople into the strongest fortifications in the ancient world. The West was losing territory, losing wealth, and losing legitimacy. The sack of Rome in 410 was only the beginning. More invasions would follow, by Vandals, by Huns, by Goths, and each one pushed the West closer to collapse. So what do we learn from this division? That Rome was no longer a single empire, but two very different worlds. One world, in the East, was strong enough to survive for 1,000 years more. The other, in the West, was fragile, vulnerable, and heading toward destruction. The question now was simple: how long could the West hold on? The invasions were growing stronger, the emperors weaker, and the shadow of collapse loomed larger with each decade. The next chapters of Rome's story would not be about triumph, but about survival, and ultimately, about loss. After 395 CE, when the empire was permanently divided, the two halves moved along very different paths. In the East, Constantinople grew into a mighty, fortified city, guarding trade routes and projecting stability. In the West, Rome and its provinces struggled to defend themselves. The West faced constant invasions, collapsing finances, and rulers who lacked the strength to stop the decline. Over the next 60 years, the Western Roman Empire would move steadily toward disaster. The first great shock came in 410 CE, when the Visigoths, led by their king Alaric, marched on Rome. Years earlier, these Goths had fled into Roman territory to escape the advancing Huns. Instead of being welcomed, they were mistreated, taxed, and abused by Roman officials. Resentment grew until rebellion broke out. Alaric, once a Roman ally, turned against the empire. The Goths roamed through Italy, besieging cities, demanding land and recognition. Negotiations with Emperor Honorius, who hid safely in Ravenna, failed. Finally, Alaric and his army entered Rome itself. For 3 days, they looted the Eternal City. Though they spared churches and avoided total destruction, the symbolism was devastating. Rome, the city that had ruled the world, had been taken by barbarians. Pagan critics claimed it was punishment for abandoning the old gods in favor of Christianity. Christians argued it showed that earthly cities, even Rome, could fall. But the city of God, faith, endured. Whatever the interpretation, the sack of 410 marked the beginning of the West's visible collapse. Yet Rome still endured, at least for a while. New threats rose as old ones faded. In the mid-5th century, the Vandals, another Germanic people, crossed from Spain into North Africa. There, under their king Genseric, they seized Carthage in 439 CE. This was a catastrophic loss for the West. North Africa was Rome's breadbasket, its richest province, the source of the grain that fed Italy. Losing it meant not only economic ruin, but also food shortages for the heart of the empire. While the Vandals grew strong in Africa, other enemies closed in. The Huns, fierce nomads from the steppes, pressed into Roman territory. Under their famous leader Attila, they ravaged the Balkans, invaded Gaul, and even threatened Italy itself. In 452 CE, Attila marched toward Rome, his armies burning and looting as they advanced. The city trembled, expecting destruction. But in a remarkable moment, Pope Leo I went out to meet Attila personally. What he said is unknown, but Attila turned back, sparing Rome. Even so, the message was clear. It was no longer emperors who protected the empire, but church leaders. Meanwhile, the Western emperors themselves were weak and often powerless. Honorius, who watched the sack of Rome from Ravenna, is remembered as one of Rome's least effective rulers. Later emperors like Valentinian III struggled to command respect, relying heavily on generals like Aetius. Aetius, called the last of the Romans, managed to hold the empire together for a time, defeating Attila at the Battle of the Catalaunian Plains in 451 CE. But when Valentinian murdered Aetius in 454 CE, he destroyed his best defender. Not long after, Valentinian himself was assassinated, leaving the empire leaderless. The very next year, in 455 CE, Rome was sacked again, this time by the Vandals. Unlike Alaric's Goths, who stayed only 3 days, the Vandals looted the city for 2 full weeks. Temples, palaces, and treasures were stripped bare. Even the sacred vessels of the old Temple of Jerusalem, once carried to Rome by Titus after the Jewish revolt, were taken away. From this sack comes our word, vandalism. The West had lost not just its wealth, but its dignity. So why did the West decline so rapidly, while the East survived? Part of the answer lies in geography. Constantinople was protected by massive walls and surrounded by sea, while Italy was exposed to invasion. Part lies in economics. The East was richer, more urban, and more stable, while the West depended heavily on agriculture and a shrinking tax base. And part lies in leadership. The Eastern emperors, though not always brilliant, maintained stronger administration. The West was plagued by child emperors, weak rulers, and constant civil wars. But there was also something deeper at work. The empire was changing. Power was shifting from emperors to generals, from Rome to Constantinople, and from pagan traditions to the Christian Church. Bishops increasingly acted as leaders when emperors failed. Rome was no longer the unstoppable force it once had been. It was now one power among many, struggling to survive in a world it had once dominated. By 455 CE, the signs were clear. The Western Roman Empire had lost much of its territory, much of its wealth, and much of its prestige. Its enemies grew stronger, its leaders weaker. The sack by the Vandals was not the end, but it was close. The empire was tottering, and the final collapse was now only a generation away. By 455 CE, the Western Roman Empire was a shadow of its former self. Its richest provinces were gone, its armies weakened, and its emperors powerless. The sack of Rome by the Vandals that year symbolized just how far the empire had fallen. But the decline was not over. In the next 2 decades, the Western Empire would stumble from one crisis to another, until finally, in 476 CE, it disappeared forever. After the death of Valentinian III and the sack by the Vandals, a series of short-lived emperors sat on the throne. Most were puppets, chosen and controlled by powerful generals or foreign leaders. Real authority rested not in the imperial palace, but in the hands of warlords who commanded the few legions still loyal to the West. One of these figures was Ricimer, a Germanic general who acted as kingmaker in Italy. He never claimed the throne himself, but he placed and removed emperors at will. For 16 years, he was the true power behind the scenes, while emperors came and went. Under his influence, the empire lost more territory. The Vandals continued to dominate the seas from North Africa, raiding Italy itself. In Gaul and Spain, Germanic kingdoms of Visigoths and Burgundians grew stronger. In Britain, Roman rule had long since collapsed. Meanwhile, in the east, the Byzantine emperors in Constantinople still claimed to rule both halves of the empire, but their influence in the west was weak. When they tried to send armies to reclaim territory, they were defeated by the Vandals. The once mighty empire was now divided not just politically, but militarily and culturally. The final blow came from a new Germanic people, the Heruli, led by Odoacer. In 476 CE, Odoacer deposed the boy emperor Romulus Augustulus, a teenager placed on the throne by his father Orestes. The irony of the name was striking. Romulus, like Rome's mythical founder, and Augustus, like Rome's first emperor. But this Romulus was no founder and no ruler. He was the last Western emperor, powerless, forgotten, and swept aside without much resistance. When Odoacer removed Romulus Augustulus, he did not bother to appoint a new emperor in the West. Instead, he declared himself King of Italy, ruling in the name of the Eastern Emperor in Constantinople. The Western Roman Empire, which had once stretched across Europe, Africa, and the Middle East, was gone. The year 476 CE became the traditional date of its fall. But was it really the end of Rome? The answer is both yes and no. The Western Empire was finished, its emperors gone, its provinces carved into barbarian kingdoms. Yet in the East, the Roman Empire continued. Constantinople thrived as the new Rome, preserving Roman law, administration, and culture for another 1,000 years. Historians today call it the Byzantine Empire, but its people called themselves Romans. And even in the West, Rome never truly disappeared. The Germanic kings who replaced the emperors adopted Roman customs, Roman law, even Roman titles. The Church, now firmly Christian, carried forward Rome's spiritual and cultural legacy. Latin remained the language of learning and law. Roman roads, aqueducts, and cities endured. In many ways, Rome did not fall, it transformed. Still, the fall of the West was a turning point in history. For centuries, the Western Roman Empire had been the most powerful force in Europe. Its legions had conquered lands from Britain to North Africa. Its laws, roads, and culture had bound together dozens of peoples. Its emperors had commanded the loyalty of millions. But in the end, it could not withstand the pressures of invasion, economic collapse, and internal weakness. Think about how extraordinary this is. A city founded, according to legend, by Romulus in 753 BCE had grown into the greatest empire the world had ever seen. It lasted for more than 1,000 years. And then, in 476 CE, its western half was gone. But the idea of Rome, the dream of empire, the model of law and order, the memory of its glory, lived on. Kings, popes, and even later empires would all claim to be heirs of Rome. So what was lost in 476? Not the name of Rome, not its culture, not even its religion. What was lost was the empire itself, the political power that had once united the West. And with that, Europe entered a new age, the Middle Ages, a time when Rome's ruins became the foundations of kingdoms, churches, and new civilizations. The fall of the Western Roman Empire is often seen as the end of the ancient world, but it is also the beginning of something else, the Europe we know today. Without Rome's collapse, there would be no medieval kingdoms, no Renaissance rediscovery of Roman culture, no modern nations shaped by Rome's legacy. Rome may have fallen, but in falling, it shaped the future. In 476 CE, the Western Roman Empire fell. Romulus Augustus was deposed, Odoacer ruled Italy, and the provinces of Gaul, Spain, and Africa were under the control of Germanic kingdoms. To many, it looked like the end of Rome. But in the east, the empire endured. Constantinople stood strong, its walls unbroken, its emperors ruling as Romans. For another 1,000 years, the Eastern Roman Empire, what we now call the Byzantine Empire, carried the torch of Rome. At first, the Byzantines did not see themselves as anything other than Roman. Their emperors bore Roman titles, their laws were Roman, and their armies marched under Roman standards. Constantinople, founded by Constantine, was built as a new Rome. It had forums, aqueducts, palaces, and a senate. Its people spoke Greek more than Latin, but they still called themselves Romaioi, Romans. The strength of the East came from its wealth and its geography. Constantinople sat on the Bosporus, a natural crossroads between Europe and Asia. Its position made it rich from trade and nearly impossible to capture. Massive walls encircled the city, strengthened over centuries until they became legendary. While barbarian armies plundered the West, Constantinople resisted siege after siege. Under emperors like Justinian in the 6th century, the Byzantines even dreamed of restoring the old empire. Justinian's generals, Belisarius and Narses, reconquered North Africa from the Vandals, Italy from the Ostrogoths, and parts of Spain. For a brief moment, it seemed as if the Roman Empire might be reborn in its entirety. Justinian also left behind another legacy, the Corpus Juris Civilis, or body of civil law. This vast collection of Roman laws, reformed and organized, became the foundation of legal systems in Europe for centuries to come. But the Byzantines were not simply preserving the past. They were also creating something new. Christianity became the heart of their identity. Great churches like the Hagia Sophia rose in Constantinople, their domes soaring above the city. Art, icons, and mosaics reflected a fusion of Roman tradition and Christian faith. The empire became a bridge between the ancient world and the medieval, between Rome and Christendom. Still, the Byzantines faced endless challenges. Persian wars drained resources. In the 7th century, Arab armies driven by the new religion of Islam swept across the Middle East and North Africa, taking lands that had been Roman for centuries. Egypt, Syria, and Palestine all lost. Later came Bulgars, Slavs, and Turks pressing on the borders. Yet through it all, Constantinople held out. Meanwhile, in the West, the legacy of Rome shaped a new world. Germanic kings styled themselves as Roman heirs. In 800 CE, Charlemagne, king of the Franks, was crowned Emperor of the Romans by the Pope, a title meant to revive the Western Empire. Centuries later, the Holy Roman Empire in Germany would claim the same title. Even though the Western Empire was gone, the dream of Rome lived on. Rome's legacy also endured in language and law. Latin remained the language of the church, of learning, of government. The Romance languages, Italian, French, Spanish, Portuguese, Romanian, were all born from it. Roman law influenced medieval codes and modern constitutions. Roman architecture, engineering, and philosophy left their mark on every generation that followed. Back in the East, the Byzantine Empire endured for 1,000 years after 476, but it too eventually fell. In 1453, Constantinople was conquered by the Ottoman Turks, and the last Byzantine emperor, Constantine V, died defending the city. With that, the Eastern Roman Empire was gone, and yet even in its fall, the legacy of Rome passed on. The Ottomans claimed to be heirs of Rome. In Moscow, rulers began calling themselves Tsars, from Caesar, and Russia became the Third Rome. So, did Rome really fall? Or did it simply change? In one sense, the Western Empire collapsed under the weight of invasions, corruption, and weakness. But in another sense, Rome never truly died. Its laws, its language, its faith, and its idea of empire lived on in Byzantium, in medieval Europe, and even in the modern world. Every capital that builds monuments, every government that writes constitutions, every empire that claims legitimacy from the past owes something to Rome. Think about it. A small city on the banks of the Tiber, founded, so the legend goes, by Romulus and Remus, grew into the greatest empire of the ancient world. It survived kings, republics, civil wars, and emperors. It ruled for over 1,000 years in the West, and another 1,000 in the East. Few civilizations in history have lasted so long, and fewer still have left such a mark. When we say Rome fell, what we really mean is that one form of Rome ended, but Rome itself lived on, in Byzantium, in Europe, in law, in language, in culture. Even today, the idea of Rome, its grandeur, its power, its legacy, still shapes how we imagine civilization. The Roman Empire may have died in 476 or in 1453, or perhaps not at all, because Rome in some way never ended.